So if I could get your attention, I'm Ben Domenech. I'm the publisher of the Federalist. I want to thank you for everyone here at the Heritage Foundation for having us here today. This was initially going to be a debate that I was going to moderate between House Judiciary Chairman Bob Goodlatte and Senator Mike Lee. Unfortunately, the chairman could not join us today, so I'll just be talking with Senator Lee here about the filibuster for a few minutes and hopefully giving you some interesting insight into the conversation that's currently going on about the filibuster and whether it's going to continue. So, thanks. Thanks, Senator. I just wanted to start by thanking you for taking the time to join us today. I know that you have a very busy schedule, and we certainly appreciate you taking the time to join us to talk about this important topic. I know that this is something that's very important to you for a number of reasons, and I think that from my perspective, this is one of those situations that reminds me of that quote from G.K. Chesterton about fences. That you see the fence in the middle of the road, and you say, you know, this is something that we should just knock down, get it out of the way, that kind of a thing. But that someone who's more considerate, who's sort of more intelligent in thinking about reforms, would look at something like that and say, well, maybe that fence has a purpose. Maybe it's there for a reason. Maybe we shouldn't just knock it down until we can understand why it's there. So maybe give me a little bit of perspective and give our audience here today a little bit of perspective on the filibuster, on the current conversation that's happening as you understand it.
The filibuster is a fence. It's a good analogy. It definitely applies here. It has a purpose. And let me just start by saying that if you forget everything else I say today, which I wouldn't blame you for, but if you remember just one thing, it should be this. It is fundamental to the operation of the Senate and to the rules of the Senate that, number one, all senators are equal, and number two, that the default rule is unlimited debate. We're supposed to be a deliberative body, much more so than the House of Representatives. Our smaller size permits that. And in some ways, the fact that states are equally represented in the Senate by dictate of the Constitution itself means that we have a special obligation to provide more open, honest, robust debate than they do in the House of Representatives. The sheer size of the House of Representatives dictates that they do certain things differently for the sake of expediency, the sake of efficiency. For similar reasons, we shouldn't do that in the Senate. So the filibuster really started out for the first more than the first century of our republic's history. The basic gist of the filibuster rule was that the orders of the day included unlimited debate. As long as any senator wanted to continue to debate anything, they could. 100 years ago, 99 years ago, in fact, that changed, and they adopted a tool called cloture, whereby a whole bunch of senators, 2/3 of the senators at the time, could force the debate to a close through this mechanism called cloture. That 2/3 supermajority threshold was about a half century later changed to a 3/5 supermajority threshold, and that's where we are now. But it does have a reason, and the reason is to ensure open, honest debate, equality of senators, and that's important to the process.
Is the problem with the filibuster today that people are finding in the House one that really has to do with wanting to have popular legislation that they want to get through and move forward? And what would you say to a response, for someone like Chairman Goodlatte, if he was here, would probably point to something like blocking the Iran nuclear deal, the approach of the Pain Capable Unborn Protection Act, something like that, and basically say, hey, if we can get rid of the filibuster and get these things through, that's more important.
Okay. First of all, let me make a very practical response to that one first, and then I'll make a more philosophical one. The practical response to it is that right now, if we were to do that right now, to what end? We have a president who would veto anything that we would pass along those lines. So why would we undo it now? Especially considering that if we undo it now, later on when the Democrats are running the place, they'll force through measures just as efficiently as we would, and we'll be powerless to stop them. The fact is that the filibuster has helped us stop a lot of bad legislation. And if we got rid of it, it would then be used as a vehicle for passing lots of bad legislation that we would dislike. The more philosophical position is that in the long view of things, I think we can still benefit from the good things that the filibuster rule has to offer without incurring all of the detrimental aspects of it, if we'll simply force the Senate to operate the way that it was supposed to. Meaning, the things that people find most frustrating about the filibuster right now are that a lot of good ideas are born in the House of Representatives, passed in the House of Representatives, get to the Senate, and die. But I think we could push a lot more things through and ultimately secure passage of more things than currently get passed in the Senate if we kept senators in session. If we forced lots of votes, you ultimately exhaust members in their ability, their willingness, their inclination to continue extending debate. And ultimately, you can get to the point of cloture on a lot more measures than you would otherwise get as we continue to operate on our truncated schedule that we have now.
Isn't what you're basically saying there that that there would be a bigger response if they can't go home on Fridays?
Yes, yes. Very good point. So let's say if we're trying to get on a spending bill to fund defense operations, fund the Pentagon. They won't give us cloture on the motion to proceed. Okay, let's stay through the weekend. Let's stay through the next weekend if we have to. Let's stay in session continuously for weeks on end if we have to. Let's invoke what's called the two-speech rule, that in the context of a motion to proceed, says that no one senator may offer more than 2 speeches against the motion to proceed. And after you've exhausted all those who want to give their 2 speeches, in theory at least, you should be able to get to cloture with only 51 votes. You should be able to pass that motion to proceed with only 51 votes. So there are a lot of things that we could do if we were willing to stay through the weekend.
Which is, of course, unheard of. In terms of ending the filibuster, wouldn't the effect of that actually be something that drives the Senate toward being a more partisan entity as opposed to a less partisan one, in the sense that just like the House, you would have a situation where there would be much more of an incentive for kind of top-down control, that type of thing, as opposed to having individual members having the ability to bring up issues on the floor, that essentially changing the way the institution behaves?
Without question. If we got rid of the filibuster rule, the Senate would become a much more distinctively, decidedly partisan institution. It would become far more efficient. I will grant you that. There's no question about it. And a lot of you would hate it as a result. You would hate that very feature of it. The efficiency of it would drive you crazy, in part because it would become a hyper-partisan organization that would rush through the will and the whim of whoever is running the majority party. And I think a lot of people in this room would not really like that outcome.
Should there be a distinction between filibustering legislation, judges, independent agency heads, non-life tenured appointments, things of that nature? Should there be a distinction there?
All right. There is not a distinction under the rules. The rules don't distinguish, as they're written, between whether we're filibustering, whether we're voting on cloture on a piece of legislation on the one hand, or cloture on a presidential nominee on the other hand. The rules make no distinction. Rule 22 says that it takes 3/5 of the senators to do that. Harry Reid went nuclear about 1.5 years ago, and what that means is that when the chair ruled after we failed to get 60 votes on cloture on a presidential nominee appointed by President Obama, Harry Reid appealed the ruling of the chair. And when you appeal the ruling of the chair, you can undo the ruling of the chair by 51 votes, a simple majority, lower than the 60 votes that it takes to get cloture. We call that the nuclear option because it could easily spread into other things and cause all kinds of damage to all the Senate rules if you did it that way. He purported to limit the going nuclear effort only to presidential nominees. And so our precedent now suggests that that is the way we operate, but the rules still require 3/5 on both of them.
Isn't the argument from someone who supports getting rid of the filibuster that essentially Reid and the Democrats would effectively pursue that end for everything inevitably when they have the next opportunity or the next big issue that they care about?
That is the argument. That is an argument raised by many. And I get the argument. It doesn't mean it's a particularly good idea to hasten it. In fact, I think it's a colossally bad idea to hasten it. And when we purport to be the party that lives by the rules and that believes that our laws consist of words, and for our laws to mean something, the words underlying them have to mean something. We could pass a resolution in the Senate declaring that an hour now consists of 73 minutes. But that wouldn't change the reality of things. We could pass a law declaring that the speed of light is in fact only 100 miles per hour, but that would not change the reality of things.
Should the filibuster be waived for bills to repeal laws passed via reconciliation?
Well, almost no bill passed by reconciliation is a bill that couldn't be undone by reconciliation. And something done with reconciliation can be done with a 51-vote threshold without the 60-vote cloture standard. So the short answer to your question is, yeah, probably.
Okay. Is that a line that could be maintained, though?
I don't know. I mean, I think it would work as long as we went through the reconciliation process appropriately, as long as we used as long as we dotted all the I's and crossed all the T's in the appropriate manner. We used the budget process, adopted appropriate reconciliation instructions to go after whatever bill was passed using reconciliation. I think we could do that.
Okay. You were mentioning earlier that the idea of being on the side of the Constitution, of having rules, of having laws. Is it even possible in this day and age to have norms or rules when it comes to the rules of Congress? And should there be more of an effort made to invert the way that those rules currently function, to make them perhaps be more biased in favor of less government as opposed to more government?
Yes. Look, the whole point of having a Constitution is that. That's the whole reason why we have a Constitution. If we weren't concerned about making it more difficult to expand government, and we weren't concerned about limiting the proper role of government, there would be no need for a Constitution at all. We would have periodic elections, elect people, and say, go do good stuff. Try not to mess it up. Don't pass bad laws, pass good laws that will benefit us and that we will like. Mm-hmm. And then they'd do whatever they wanted. And that would be a complete disaster, because that quickly devolves into a type of anarchy almost, a type of mob rule. So yeah, it should be harder, and it is harder under our constitutional system to expand government rather than contract it. I think I see where you're going with it, which is that in some ways our rules and our structure does make it harder to pass certain things reining back in government. I understand that. That still doesn't justify breaking the rules, especially, nor does it mean that it would be in our interest to do so, given that there is a whole lot of distance remaining between where we are now and, say, European-style socialism. There are people in this country, there are people in this Congress who would like to shorten that distance even more, and they would do so much more efficiently, much more quickly, much more completely if we abandoned our rules.
So, given the fact that the other side of this argument is not here, I'm going to put to you this question. What do you think the best argument is for ending the filibuster, and what would your response to that argument be?
Ooh, that's a good one. All right. I'd make it a two-part argument. Okay. Number one, the Constitution specifies in those instances where a supermajority is going to be required. It specifies, for instance, that it takes a two-thirds supermajority in both houses to override a veto. It takes a two-thirds supermajority vote in both houses to propose a constitutional amendment. It takes a two-thirds supermajority vote in the Senate to ratify a treaty. So under the, I can't resist using my Latin here, but expressio unius est exclusio ulterius, to express one is to exclude another. The fact that a supermajority is prescribed in some instances but not others would suggest, perhaps in the eyes of some, misguided as they may be, that there is to be no supermajority requirement here. So that would be part one of the argument. Part two of the argument would be, and moreover, one of the reasons why that is the case and should be the case is because of the fact that when we as a country elect a new Congress, we expect that Congress to vote in a manner consistent with our newly comprised Congress. And if that newly comprised Congress doesn't do what we want, If a majority of them doesn't do what we want, that gives us increased incentive to fire them and to move them off. A supermajority threshold as provided by this rule throws that off. Okay, so that's the argument. I'm now going to proceed, if it's okay,
Yes.
to systematically dismantle that in its entirety.
Please.
Number one, yes, the Constitution does prescribe supermajorities in other instances, and it does not prescribe the supermajority requirement for the filibuster rule. That's not constitutional, except for the fact that it kind of is. You see, Article 1, in addition to prescribing those standards, also gives us authority very clearly to establish our own rules. Each house is in charge of establishing its own rules for its own operation. And so I believe that that means, at a minimum, that we can decide how long debate lasts. If we can decide how long debate lasts, that means we can devise mechanisms by which we can decide that debate is finished and force debate to come to a close. And if we can do that, we can certainly prescribe a supermajority threshold for bringing debate to a close. And that's exactly what the cloture standard and the filibuster rule do. And so that's entirely within our authority to do that. There is nothing incompatible with the Constitution about the filibuster rule and the cloture standard. As to point two, yeah, elections have consequences. And one of the ways in which they have consequences is in enabling Congress to reconsider its rules from time to time, including each house of Congress. So the fact that there is accountability in any system that operates on a simple majority basis doesn't mean that accountability goes out the door when you have a 3/5 supermajority requirement to bring debate to a close. If anything, the democratic processes built into our constitutional structure are enhanced, not diminished, by the supermajority cloture standard. You see, because just as it's often said in First Amendment parlance, that the antidote to bad speech is not less speech and government restrictions on speech. The antidote to bad speech is more speech. So too here. The antidote to bad government, the antidote to anything that separates the people from their government and their ability to change the government, is more debates and more votes. What we need are more votes on more amendments. You remember a few weeks ago, I'm sure you've forgotten about this by now, but you probably weren't even paying attention to this one. A few weeks ago, we were delivered a 2,242-page bill, 48 hours before we were to vote on it. This bill, depending on what you count as having been spent either a little over $1 trillion or a little under $2 trillion. 2,242 pages. Arguably, spending close to $2 trillion. We were given 48 hours to read that thing. We were given not one opportunity to amend it, to improve it. Now, if we were following the filibuster rule, the cloture standard properly, which would involve actually staying in session and allowing members opportunities for input, we would have had amendments to those. And getting rid of the filibuster would actually increase rather than decrease the number of circumstances in which we're faced with a 2,242-page bill negotiated in secret over the course of months by 4 people. That's what would happen. Mm-hmm. And if you want to talk about separating the people from their government and making it more difficult for the people to have input into their republic, that'd be the best way to do it. If you want that outcome, if you want more bills like the omnibus in December of 2015, just get rid of the filibuster, and that'll do it.
I want to give everyone here the opportunity to ask some questions of Senator Lee. Sir?
Giving out this pamphlet here.
Can you?
Thank you. It's entitled Fighting to Hold Congress Accountable. It strikes me that filibusters are a way of a lot of senators avoiding being held accountable. They hide behind the filibuster so they don't have to cast a substantive vote for something that they claim they're in favor of, but they're really not. And this way they can hide it. They just hide behind somebody's filibuster. Well, we couldn't cut off debate, so I never had to take a stand on that. And isn't that, in fact, what is going on now in many instances? From 1917 to, the mid-1980s probably, there never were more than 1 or 2 filibusters a year or a session. Now you've got Well, you point out, someone wants to blow their nose, there's a filibuster over it. And it doesn't stop, so the Senate doesn't function. And as somebody, one of your colleagues from the House pointed out this morning, George Will said, if you want to know why you've got Donald Trump, look in a mirror. Congress created Donald Trump by what I think are dishonest practices, such as filibusters, such as, however, Mr. McIntosh was describing how House rules got rigged to prevent honest debate on amendments and so forth.
Sure.
First of all, you've got a very legitimate point. This is one of the points that makes me want to discuss this issue more, because you have a very legitimate grievance. And anyone who sympathizes with that argument, which I suspect many or most of you do in some way or another, I want to express the fact that I feel the same way. But let me offer a different perspective on that. First of all, it is absolutely disgraceful when somebody claims to be for it. I voted against it before I voted for it, or the other way around. They will vote for a bill on cloture, and then it never gets to completion, or they'll vote for cloture and then no on the underlying bill. Increasingly, with the advent of the internet, with the advent of more news sources that make more people aware of how people are voting, it's getting harder and harder for members to hide behind that, to hide behind a sham vote. I was for it on cloture, but I was against it. Doesn't really play very well anymore, and I hope that trend will continue. I expect that it will continue. As the other point I wanted to raise with it is that the filibuster rule is the one thing that periodically does allow us to get more votes on more provisions. The way it is supposed to work when the Senate is functioning properly is that on amendments, our amendments are supposed to be set at a 51 vote threshold. That's supposed to be the standard. You have almost infinitely more votes, exponentially more votes, I can definitely say, with the filibuster rule than you would ever have without it. Because it's the filibuster rule that gives other members the incentive to continue to agree to more votes on more amendments. So you're actually increasing the accountability of members of the Senate by having the rule than you would have if you didn't have the rule. And that in turn increases their accountability to their members. Because again, if we got rid of it, what happened with the omnibus, where we were given 48 hours to review this 2,242-page, $2 trillion spending bill? That would become the norm. I mean, it happens far too often right now, but that would become commonplace because you wouldn't have the same incentives to offer members votes on amendments.
Let's.
You have a point. I'm happy to sponsor that one as well.
Sir.
Stuart Reuter. One of the most used or maybe abused words today has been debate. My understanding of the modern filibuster is that there is no debate going on. It's essentially a hold. The only debate we see is an old Mr. Smith movie and perhaps Senator Cruz trying to do something. Why are we not forcing the continuation of debate under the filibuster rule?
It's actually part of what I'm describing when I talk about invoking the two-speech rule on what we call front-end cloture, or the motion to proceed. During that phase, at least, you would have to keep talking. You would have to exhaust all of your rights. I mean, those who were wanting to block cloture on the motion to proceed would need to continue speaking, and they'd perhaps need to team together, each using up their two speech slots. And so, yeah, I do think that's important.
Has that happened?
No, it hasn't happened because we haven't been operating that way. Instead, we'll have a front-end cloture vote, a vote on cloture on the motion to proceed, and if we get, say, 53, 54 votes on a motion on cloture on a motion to proceed, say, to a defense authorization bill, then we say, oh, well, I guess that's it. We got to go home for the week. Got fundraisers tomorrow. Let's adjourn. And that's what I'm saying, is if we didn't do that, and if we stayed in session requiring members to actually debate on it, we would exhaust those who were raising objections to it. And once you get actually on the bill, and the more you have votes on amendments on that bill, the more likely it is that the measure ultimately passes, because it gets momentum. It becomes like a snowball, which, when rolling down a mountain, acquires more mass, acquires more momentum, and it's harder and harder to stop, and it eventually passes. That is a good question. And it is a question that has to do with the scheduling of the Senate, with decisions to adjourn, and those are made by others in the Senate who are not me.
Sir.
Samuel Taylor. Going back to the omnibus bill, now this thing passed, and there's great anger, and this is part of the ripple effect that's driving the Trump effect. So, pardon me for being dense, maybe you've already explained this. How did this happen under a Republican control or majority Senate if, in fact, they knew this was going to be a nightmare? I mean, Ryan has already said, oh, it's a mess. And now he's going to regular order. But let's go back. How did that happen? Such a fiasco, which I believe, I'm right, I don't know your voting record, but I believe you didn't vote for the thing.
Correct. Okay. Correct.
I feel better about that. But how did that happen?
Okay.
If we have these rules that will slow this thing down.
Okay. Good question. First of all, whenever we govern by cliff, we govern by cliff when we set a deadline, and then we push up our movement onto legislation dealing with that deadline up to the last possible minute. Sometimes it's minutes before, sometimes it's minutes after, sometimes it's just a couple of days before. When we legislate like that, then members get all tense and they get into a frenzy and they vote for things that they wouldn't otherwise vote for. The only way to avoid that kind of thing is for us to get onto the bill much sooner and to require members to actually debate it. If we had gotten on, I don't have a categorical objection to using an omnibus bill. There's nothing sacred about having 12 separate spending bills. It is what the Budget Act of 1974 contemplates. But that requirement was not carved into stone tablets on Mount Sinai. I would much rather have, when faced between 12 separate appropriations bills, each with minimal or no process, no amendments, or a single omnibus with weeks or even months of debate, discussion, and amendments, I would choose the latter every time. That's the problem. We have to get onto the bill sooner. The other part of the problem is we will continue to operate like that as long as members vote for it. The fact that we had enough Republicans who voted for it, enough Republicans who joined most or nearly every Democrat to vote for it, makes it that much more likely it's going to happen next time. This isn't going to stop until we get to the point where members, at least our own members, won't vote for something like that, and where they'll take a principled vote against it. If nothing else, they haven't had the chance to read 2,242 pages in 48 hours. I'm not that smart. I can't read that much legislative text in 48 hours. And so we need more people who are willing to vote no for that reason alone. And when we do get a critical mass of people who will vote no for that reason alone, this will stop. But it has nothing to do with the filibuster rule. And I can assure you, if we were to abandon the filibuster rule, this kind of thing would become more common, not less.
Should we do one
more,
question?
one more.
But we need to keep it
I
very
asked
short.
this question earlier and did not get an answer.
From a politician, that would never happen.
Yeah, I know. In Arizona, we're having a tremendous problem with the national popular vote issue. Where in the Constitution does the state legislators get the authority to determine how our votes are to be counted without getting the approval of the citizens of that state?
I'm not sure I understand your question.
Well, they want Arizona to join the interstate compact. So therefore, instead of counting it as an electoral vote, as we do today, the compact then says, if the popular vote winner wins.
Oh, okay.
So where do they get that authority to make that move without approval of the citizens of that state?
Well, They don't. I mean, first of all, no state can be brought into an interstate compact without that state's consent. Secondly, any interstate compact is required under Article 1 of the Constitution to be approved by Congress.
No, that's not, no. The Supreme Court has said, now there's a narrow window in there. So if it's a compact, you're building a bridge and you want a compact between two states, that's fine. As long as it's a local or regional issue. Now we're getting into a national issue with national implications and perhaps infringing on the power of the federal government. So where does that break come and where do they get the authority to do this?
Well, again, they don't. I mean,
Well,
with
they do.
the
All right,
type
let's
of, the
let
type
the
of
senator
content,
answer, and then we got a
the type of
reception.
compact you're describing does affect, it affects our national political system. And even though there is some ambiguity at the margins regarding interstate compacts, the Supreme Court has been very clear on the type of compact you're describing. I mean, not that specific kind, but any compact that fundamentally rearranges the relative rights of states or that fundamentally changes some aspect of the way our states interact with each other, that would require approval by Congress. Now, there might be some constitutional problems on top of that, in that one arguably would interfere with other freestanding constitutional provisions. So you've arguably got an additional problem on top of the need for congressional approval of the compact, in that the compact itself might be unconstitutional because the compact itself would contradict the parts of the Constitution that prescribe the procedures we use in the Electoral College. So I think I'm with you on this one. And I'm actually, I was born in Arizona. I moved away involuntarily when I was only a year old.
Let's give our thanks to the senator for being so generous with his time.
In 1962, John F. Kennedy had a gathering at the White House of Nobel Prize winners, and he commented that it was the greatest collection of human knowledge at the White House, with the possible exception of when Thomas Jefferson dined alone. I enjoyed this last panel because I can now judge any future discussion to the quality of the time Mike Lee came over and debated the filibuster with himself at the Heritage Foundation. I know we all want to thank our speakers. I want to thank you all. I think that the size and the stamina of this audience, listening to all of these ideas, these proposals that we had today, is proof that what people actually want are policies. They want less talk of what the horse race looks like, who's up, who's down. They want to talk about policy. That's what we did today. That's what your presence here today affirmed. You have all earned a drink, and so we have a reception outside. We hope that you'll stay. But ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. This meeting is adjourned.